Conservationist and entomologist Douglas Tallamy's best-selling books have encouraged thousands of readers to participate in conservation efforts starting in our own backyards. From planting a diversity of native species, protecting the tiniest members of the food web, and encouraging local politicians to prioritize reversing habitat destruction, Tallamy offers a blueprint to protect nature for future generations. In Tallamy's latest book, The Nature of Oaks, he focuses on one of our ecosystem's most important species, the mighty oak tree. For today's conversation, Douglas Tallamy is joined by Gene Ponzi, host of KDHX Radio's weekly environmental podcast, Earthworms, and Green Resources Manager for the Missouri Botanical Gardens Earthways Center. This presentation is part of St. Louis County Library's Partners for Native Landscaping series. More information is available at www.slcl.org/events. Douglas Tallamy's books are available for purchase from Left Bank Books, St. Louis's premier independent bookstore.
Doug Tallamy, what a pleasure to see you again.
It is always fun to talk to you, Jean.
This time around, this year, we get to hear especially about oaks from your book, The Nature of Oaks, Partners for Native Landscaping. So happy to have you talking about that. What was one of the first connections, big connections you made with oaks and the value of oak trees compared to other, especially other native species?
My first connection with oaks was I like to climb trees. So I was a little boy and white oaks were perfect. They had big limbs, usually pretty low, and you could get up there. So I always liked white oaks, but it really was our research on host plant relationships between caterpillars and plants that pointed at oaks as being the very best in terms of supporting caterpillars. And more research showed that, hey, caterpillars are the most important insects we have in terms of supporting food webs. And then more research showed, geez, to make it one nest of birds, you need thousands of caterpillars. So it all started to come together. And we need the plants that make thousands of caterpillars. And nothing does that better than oaks.
If I look up in an oak tree, am I going to see that thing crawling with caterpillars?
No, as a matter of fact, that's a complaint I get. So you talk about all these caterpillars and we can't find them. Well, the birds are looking for those caterpillars too, and they are much better at finding them than we are. So it actually, allays some of the fears people have. Oh, if we have, like, for example, where I live, there are 557 species of caterpillars that eat oaks. It seems like the oaks will be defoliated all the time. But there are all the birds that eat those caterpillars, hundreds of them every day. And then there's all the parasitoids that control those caterpillars and all the other predators. So there's an entire network of natural enemies that keeps those caterpillars in check, including lots of diseases that keep them in check. So the problem today is we don't have enough caterpillars. It's not, we've got so many, they're going to defoliate us.
And choice of trees is really going to support caterpillar proliferation, yeah?
Yeah, there's a concept we call Keystone Species. It turns out that just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillars that drive our food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of those caterpillars. So it's all bunched up, those really important plants, oaks being the best, that are generating most of the food. So we've got a lot of native plants out there and they're all contributing something. But in terms of making caterpillars, it's just a few genera, I should say, that are doing most of the work.
So I put myself today in the virtual background of a Missouri forest with Virginia bluebells, and I'm sure there are plenty of oaks in the background because our state song is oak and hickory. Although I can't, I don't know if you can tell who's in the background there, but in the city, in the suburbs, so much of what I see is like one big tree on the property, and that's what everybody has. If that big tree is an oak, is that sufficient?
The definitive research to compare that to having two big trees or three has not been done. But believe me, that is much better than having no big trees, particularly if that tree is an oak. So I actually have a grad student right now who's asking a similar question as he moves from essentially highly urbanized areas out to places like your background there. What happens to the moth populations? I've been saying we all have to plant oaks. We have to plant them everywhere, and it's going to restore biodiversity. But we need to measure that to demonstrate that it really will bring it back in cities, and it just hasn't been done. I don't want to say I see no reason why it wouldn't work. We have our lights on too much. That kills a lot of moths. We spray a lot of things. That kills a lot of moths. But there's no reason why we couldn't bring biodiversity back into cities if we modified a few of those things.
Where do you see that kind of research coming from? Any options that, conservation advocates like us here in St. Louis could lobby for?
These are perfect studies for grad students. Grad students cost a lot of money. So whoever wants to fund a grad student, you can get these things done. It's not the type of thing, I've always gotten funded from National Science Foundation or USDA, and neither one of them is big on funding conservation. So it's really, no, they fund novel science. So the fact that oaks produce caterpillars is not novel. We know this. They want to do something else now. So yeah, I can't get the money from them, but what has actually helped me out in recent years has been private donors. They say, this is important. I want to do it. Yes, I'll support a grad student. Conservation, the money is always in short supply. It's a growing need globally, and the money is always in short supply.
We're talking here for the St. Louis County Public Library System. Words are their stock in check. I wonder if there's a way to semantically vary that could generate more interest. And also your message, Doug Tallamy, so urgent that we are conservation. We need to be part of that. We can't just leave it in the hands of the few experts. How might we juggle, if you will, how we talk about this to make the measures you're talking about more popular, more accessible to people, and also potentially more attractive for the level of research you're citing we need?
We've got to convince people that that nature's not optional. That we're not going to be on this planet long without it. That's a new message to most people. People, we like wildlife or we like nature, but it's just there for entertainment. Segregating nature to someplace else isn't going to work anymore. There is no someplace else. We have to learn how to live with it. So we were building the story that nature has got to become a part of our lives so that everybody becomes part of the choir. I've been criticized, you only talk to the choir. And I say, well, it's only the choir who invites me. There are millions of people who don't understand that they are the future of conservation. We've got two global crises right now. One is climate change, of course, but the other is a biodiversity crisis. I can't make an assignment. I want you to go home and solve the climate change crisis tomorrow. But I can tell people you can go home and there's 5 or 6 things you can do that will immediately address the biodiversity crisis right where you live. They're easy things, something everybody can do. And all of a sudden you're empowered. It's no longer a declining planet that I can do nothing about. You are now empowered to do it. So the solution to our biodiversity crisis is a grassroots solution. We don't have to depend on the government, although governments are getting more and more interested in this, believe it or not. We don't have to depend on funding agencies. That'd be great if they were interested, but it's just the private citizen landowners, of course, have the opportunity to address this right where they live. That's obvious, but I don't want to exclude the 82% of us who live in cities and apartments and things. You can help too, because a land conservancy or parks are all underfunded and all understaffed, and they rely on volunteers to help to manage the properties that they have. So everybody can play a role. What we're trying to do is change the culture from an adversarial relationship with nature to a collaborative one. And we can change the culture just by changing the way we vote. You don't have to walk outside your living room. Just change the way you vote, and all of a sudden these become important issues. I was reading a book last night that said, we can't rely on our politicians. They're just not on board. They would be on board if we said, you're out of there unless you consider these things to be important. So we control what politicians are in there. It's like we work for the politicians. No, they work for us.
I really appreciate the fact that we can make plant choices that make a significant difference. You said 5 or 6 things, Doug Tallamy, that anybody can do. What's that list? Let's have it.
Okay, shrink your lawn. There's 4 things every property needs to do. It's got to sequester carbon. It's got to support a complex community of pollinators. It's got to support the food web by passing on plant energy to animals. Otherwise, we have no animals. And it's got to manage the local watershed. Those are 4 things every property has to do. Well, how do we accomplish that? Lawn accomplishes none of those. So shrink the area you have in lawn. Just have it where you're going to walk. Then put in the keystone plants that are going to support the most life, the most pollinators, and the most biodiversity. That's plant choice. You're planting the right plants. Those plants will also manage the watershed. Anything, grassroots have a root system about 2 inches deep. Anything else has a deeper root system, and that's what manages the watershed. And pollinators, put in a pollinator garden that focuses on specialist pollinators. If you plant for specialist pollinators, the generalists get to use them as well. Turn out your lights at night. Lights are killing our nocturnal insects every single night. And if you don't want to turn the light up, put a yellow bulb in it, because our nocturnal insects are not as attracted to yellow wavelengths. Get rid of the invasive plants that you have on your property. So many people have calorie pears, or they've got burning bush, or they've got barberry, and these things just escape, and these things invade our woods. So these are all easy things that people can do. Stop using pesticides at home. You don't need them.
No, you don't need them. Insects, you're such an advocate for insects. You are, after all, an entomologist, a bug guy, Doug Tallamy. And yet a lot of people are really creeped out by insects. Say a little bit about how you've seen people make friends with insects, or insects make friends with people. What are some of those pathways to collaboration with bugs?
First, we should stop calling them bugs. A bug is a disease.
Oh, come on now, Doug.
Insects are insects. They are not a disease. As E.O. Wilson says, they're the little things that run the world. So if we appreciate that we need them, if we didn't have pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. That's pretty important. If we didn't have the plants like oaks that are making those caterpillars to pass on the energy, we would lose all the animals. If plants don't pass on their energy, that's what animals eat. They eat the energy plants have, through photosynthesis, turned into food. If we get rid of our insects, we get rid of our decomposers. So we just have to rely on bacteria and fungi to break things down. It would be a rotting mess. We absolutely depend on insects. So we have to stop generalizing. The few that are a pest or bite us and pass on diseases, they're there. I get that. But that's a tiny, tiny minority. Most kids are not born with a fear of insects. It's their parents that teach them to be afraid. When the mother screams, there's a spider, there's something, that sends a strong message to the child. This is danger. And they carry that with them a good long period. So,
well, my mother did that and I got over it. So I'm living proof.
You can get over it. Yes. There are a lot of people that don't even try to get over it. So
your plants pass on their energy to animals. The way in which energy moves and the way in which the reciprocity between the 2 kingdoms, the plant and the animal kingdoms, happen. I think it's a great story. It's an exciting story. And you tell that kind of story in some really wonderful ways. Give us one of the Doug Tallamy versions of how that works, will you? Maybe it's chickadees, or I'm not sure.
I will talk about chickadees. We have a lot of data on chickadees, but the chickadees are just an example of what 96% of our terrestrial birds are doing. They rear their young on insects, and our research has shown it's mostly caterpillars. When they have the option, they will take a caterpillar every time.
Not birdseed.
Well, they eat birdseed during the wintertime when they're not rearing their young. I focus on when they're raising babies. If you can't reproduce, you'd only have a few winners and then you're gone. So putting out bird food is, it helps the birds in the wintertime, no doubt. The birds that did not migrate, we have 386 species of North American birds that migrate. They're neotropical migrants, and that's because they need insects, and we don't have enough insects in the wintertime. So they go to Central and South America where there's a lot of insects. Well, the chickadee is one that stays behind. So does a titmouse. And they come to our feeders, and that's great during the wintertime. 50% of their diet in the winter is seeds. The other 50% continues to be insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they got to switch entirely to insects. And that's when they're going to focus on those caterpillars. thousands of caterpillars, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get a clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, they're not done, because the parents will continue to feed caterpillars to the babies outside of the nest for another 21 days. So you are talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees. That's 2 parents. So if you want a breeding population of chickadees, that's a bunch of parents. You need a lot more than that. And if you want cardinals and blue jays and titmice and mockingbirds and all the other birds we consider to be common around here, count the number of caterpillars that you need then. So who's making those caterpillars? It's the plants, of course, but not all the plants. This is where it's important. This is where the non-native plants are so destructive, because they make few or no caterpillars, because our caterpillars are unable to eat them, to use them as food. All plants are protected with phytochemicals. Their leaves taste bad. So it's only the insects that have the adaptations to get around those phytochemicals can eat those particular plants. And this is where the monarch is a perfect example. Milkweeds are toxic plants. They're filled with cardiac glycosides and sticky latex sap that glues their mouth parts together. But monarchs have the adaptations to be able to get around those. 90% of the insects that eat plants have similar adaptations to get around particular plant lineages. Most insects can eat very few plant lineages. So they're host plant specialists. So when we bring in the Bradford pear or the burning bush or the barberry or all the other things, whether they're invasive or not, very few things can eat them. So that pretty much ends the food web in your yard. And of course, if they escape into natural areas, it ends it there as well. So this is where plant choice matters. You've got to pick the plants that support the food web, or you don't have a food web, and then eventually you don't have an ecosystem.
And not that those plants that wouldn't support the food web are bad. They're probably going to be species of plants, types of plants that are native to another part of the world that would have that wonderful relationship if they were growing in their part of the world, not in the part of the world that we move them to.
That's largely true. But most of these plants, these ornamental plants, one of the attributes they were selected for is that nothing can eat them. Pest-free. We want pest-free plants. Remember, we've got a lot of native plants that very many things can't eat too. So the horticulture trade would say, hey, these are great. We'll take them someplace else. Nothing can eat them.
So that takes us into the area of what is a native plant, what might be what is called a nativar. Maybe the foliage was bred to be purple instead of green, or it blooms at a different time, or, plant breeding, tinkering, woo-woo.
Okay, well, a native plant, by my definition, is one that has shared an evolutionary history with the plants and animals around it. Plants do move. The glaciers come down and they all run to the south, and the glaciers recede and they all come north. So saying it was here forever, that's not actually accurate. But the community moves with it up and down. And these relationships, like the things that eat oaks, have been eating oaks for millions of years, wherever the oaks went. Those are very old relationships. So, for example, a blue spruce, it's native to North America. It's actually native to a very small range in the Rockies. You can take it out and plant it in Delaware and it'll do fine, but nothing will be able to eat it in Delaware. It's separated from the community with which it evolved. Mm-hmm. A nativar or a cultivar of any plant is simply a genetic variant of the trait species. It's a slice of the genome that is producing a trait that everybody likes. So maybe if you have a native plant, you make a tall plant short, that's a particular genotype that's not going to get very tall. Or maybe it has resistance to powdery mildew. A very common cultivar, as you mentioned, is taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. So we've done an experiment and shown that that's the one that really nails insect herbivores, because it loads the leaves with nasty tasting compounds, anthocyanins. And you take a good native plant and all of a sudden make it inedible. It's because we want to have a red leaf redbud. Why? I think they're ugly, but I mean, it's, these cultivars, most of them it's just fashion. Yeah. The nursery trade said we have to change the cultivar every year so that people keep buying plants, but they are getting the message that people want to buy plants for function, not just for aesthetics. And that's a very valuable message. And then more and more of them will start to carry trait species.
And are nursery trade here in St. Louis, our locally owned garden centers are part of Grow Native, are now beyond the Missouri borders native plant program. They're part of organizations like Wild Ones, or, they contribute to the Partners for Native Landscaping seminar series that St. Louis County Library is hosting this spring. I always ask you, Doug Tallamy, anytime you talk to us in St. Louis, to give a shout out to how good we're doing.
I use St. Louis as an example. And unfortunately, this because you keep getting emails from people who say, Doug Tallamy told me to talk to you.
I love it when you do that. Thank you.
I do think, and Jean, you get an awful lot of credit for this. You've got a number of wonderful people there working on native plant conservation and how powerful they are in St. Louis. But you've been at the top of the list, and there's so many organizations that you have put together for years. So St. Louis has been a leader for years in the native plant movement, which of course is the conservation movement. So, yep, I will give you a shout out.
So back to oaks, Doug Tallamy. One of the really interesting adaptations that oaks have is the oaks that hold their leaves all winter. I have a couple of species of oaks in my yard that do that, and I believe that has a relationship to woolly mammoths.
Well, that's the hypothesis anyway. It's the white oak group. It's called the Quercus group. So members of the white oak group don't drop their leaves in the fall when all the other deciduous trees do, and they'll hold them all winter long. So right away, as a landscape attribute, that means your oak can be a screen. If you don't like your neighbor, you can screen out your neighbor by planting an oak, both during the summer and the winter. But it's a curious behavior, and ecologists try to explain that. And the leading hypothesis is that it wasn't long ago, 9,000 years ago, and that's not long, where North America, actually most of the planet, was covered with huge Pleistocene mammals. There were 3 species of mammoths in Mexico alone. There was the giant sloth that could reach up 18 feet. There were 44 species of rhinoceros. We had a lot of things here, and many of them were browsers. A browser is like the white-tailed deer. It's not eating grass in your lawn. It's eating woody material, typically the buds that are going to produce next year's foliage. That's where all the nutrition is. Oaks were very clever. They surrounded those buds, those nutritious buds, with dead leaves from the previous year. And all of a sudden, it's a mouthful of stuff we don't like. So the thinking is that that was an adaptation to keep these big browsers off oak trees. And one thing that supports that hypothesis is the distribution of those marcescent leaves. They only go up about 18 feet. After that, the branches are bare, and that's as high as the giant sloth could reach, is 18 feet. So it makes a nice story. No way I can go back and prove it, but that's what we tell people.
And it makes me think about choice of oaks as a landscape screen. I wouldn't have thought about that, about species of oaks, because, that is something that people like. You like to have some privacy in your yard. Well, if you have bush honeysuckle, you're going to have the best landscape screen of all, or, invasive bamboo, but that's a problem. That's no habitat. What are some other kinds of oaks that keep their leaves?
All the members of the white oak groups of chestnut oak, post oak, dwarf chestnut oak, swamp white oak, bur oak keeps their leaves. So these are all white oak members of the white oak group.
I want to finish up, Doug, with just your emphasis, your way of saying, getting the message across of we are conservation, and how, especially here in St. Louis, we can see, we can hear, we can meet up in our own neighborhoods with how that is working.
Well, I'm going to talk about responsibility. Everybody on the planet depends on healthy ecosystems to keep them alive. And if you got a really healthy ecosystem, you can be happy too. But that means everybody's got a responsibility to keeping those ecosystems happy. The way we've got it now, we've got a few conservation biologists and a few ecologists. Everybody else seems to have a green light to destroying our local ecosystems. That's crazy. So I want to change that. Everybody's got a responsibility, particularly if you own, quote, a piece of the earth. You've got a responsibility to take care of it. How do you do that? There's a number of ways, but planting an oak is one of the best, because you can address 3 of those 4 goals we talked about, the ecological goals of every landscape. You're going to support the most biodiversity. You're going to manage the watershed better than any other plant, and you're going to sequester more carbon. The only reason you're not going to support more pollinators is because oaks are wind pollinated. But 3 out of 4 is pretty good. So,
and then you could surround that oak with a pollinator garden so that you don't go all the way up to the trunk of the oak when you're raking leaves or when you're mowing, and you don't mow up insect larvae, right?
Exactly. That's the best way to shrink your lawn, is put beds around your trees, and all of a sudden you got less lawn.
Can you say a little bit before we wrap up here about how this way of collaborating with nature also protects human health, can help with resilience in heat islands in cities?
These are all what we call ecosystem services. This is the life support that nature delivers to us for free if we don't kill the natural systems. But they're not optional. We need pollinators because we need the plants. Planted ecosystems moderate severe weather. When we get rid of the Amazon, it's going to change the global weather patterns in very destructive and harmful ways. The really interesting research about what happens when we simply go outside and look at a tree for 15 minutes, our blood pressure goes down, our stress hormone, our cortisol goes down, we learn better, we don't get divorced, it cures our cancer, it does all kinds of. Well, you know why I'm saying that? It's because when you lower stress, we do everything better, and we really do fight diseases better. So why is walking around a wooded place going to lower your blood pressure? Well, if you hear birds singing, that's a signal that it's safe. Birds don't sing when there's a predator around. So chirping birds give us that peaceful feeling. We are okay. There's nobody hiding behind the tree. When you walk outside and it's quiet, that's when the blood pressure goes up. But a well-planted street has lower crime. So the bad guy's hiding behind the tree. That's not true. The bad guy doesn't exist when you have those trees. So there's measurable medical benefits to not just beautifying our human-dominated landscapes, but making them ecologically productive too. It benefits us in so many different ways.
And then last but not least, Doug, tell me your idea for Homegrown National Park.
Well, we got the idea when I thought about what if we cut the area of lawn in half. We've got 40 million acres of lawn in the US, which is the size of New England. So if you cut that in half, everybody cuts their lawn in half, all of a sudden we got 20 million acres we can put towards conservation. And if we do that at home, we could create a new national park. So I started calling it Homegrown National Park. And if you add up all the major national parks of the country, Homegrown National Park will be bigger than all of them put together. I've been talking about that in my talks for a long time. I wrote a chapter about it in Nature's Best Hope. But I met a woman, Michelle Elfandari, who was she was a businesswoman from Manhattan who had just retired. And she said, "You've got to get this message to the non-choir." And I said, "I know, but I don't do that." And she said, "I do that." So she created our website, homegrownnationalpark.org. She created this idea of getting on the map, where people who have joined Homegrown National Park for free, by the way, will put their location in and the amount of area that they're conserving or pledge to conserve. So if you have a woodlot, you say, "Oh, that goes on there." Then that little area of your county lights up. And the object is to watch the US light up as we get more and more records of people practicing conservation right at home on that map. We want that message to go viral so that people will want to join this grassroots effort to save the world just because they want to be part of it. That's the idea anyway.
Yeah. That is a good idea. And it's an idea that I think it's past just the rooting stage. It's in the sprouting stage. And this tells me why the firefly is a logo for that. I wondered that. And then you'll have
lighting up. We're lighting up the world.
Doug, tell me, you are the best. Thank you so much. Thanks for your work. Thanks for talking to us again. We can be partners with nature. You are such a good partner with nature. You and nature are dancing the tango, and long may you wave.
Well, you are helping me, Jean. You really are.
It's a pleasure. Doug, tell me. Thank you. Thank you.